Hi, so we are recording this session today. If you are not comfortable being being recorded, then feel free to turn your camera off and leave it off. Otherwise, please feel free to turn it on and jump in and engage with us throughout the session. My name's Caitlin Bryant, and I'm the Social Impact Specialist at First Credit Union. And First Credit Union operates on the territories of the Tla'amin people and the Squamish Nation and the Comox Nation. And so we really stand with the Indigenous peoples in this area in the South Coast who have stewarded the land here since time immemorial. Feel free to pop a note in the chat about where you're joining from today and the territory that you are on today. As I said, we're going to record the session, so we'll send that out to everyone afterwards, and you're welcome to pass that along to friends and family or colleagues so that they can watch the session, and they'll also have the promo code in there that they can use. It's really exciting for us to be doing this session today and also to be partnering with Zero Waste Canada. First Credit Union has been on our environmental responsibility journey since about 2017. And since that time, we've accomplished a lot. And one of our major accomplishments is to gather a committee of passionate employees who are interested in working in environmental sustainability within our organization. One of which is Tanya and also Helen, who are here today. So thank you both for the time that you put into that group. We've made a lot of progress, but we also realize there's so much to learn. Like, we have so much learning to do and data collection as well, just to get a sense of what we can do as an organization. And also, we're really excited about the impact that we can make within our membership and the communities that we serve. So hence we are here today. And with that said, I will just hand it over to Paolo, and thank you so much for joining us today. And he'll introduce us to Zero Waste and the training, and then we'll release the promo code and we'll be off to the races. Thanks.
All right, thank you for that, Caitlin. I'm just going to share my screen, and if you have any issues seeing, just let me know. Okay. So thanks everybody for joining, first of all. I hope it was worth your time. So once again, my name is Paolo, and I as well just wanted to start by first acknowledging that this info session is being delivered on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known as Vancouver. And we always like to start these sessions with that resource you see in the top corner, just sharing that, acknowledging also that everybody will be at a different stage along that process of reconciliation. I was telling Caitlin earlier, I myself am not from Canada, so I've learned a lot since I've been here, and those types of resources I found actually very useful, just to start by understanding whose land you're on, and even just my role as a settler on these lands as well. So if that sounds like a similar story from anybody else, that's just a resource that Zero Waste Canada likes to share before we get started. And I'd also just like to add, where possible, if possible, it's even more appropriate to start a session on zero waste this way. Since zero waste, yes, is about materials and how we manage those materials, but it's just as much about people, and really not treating any one person or a group of people as disposable. And hopefully by the end of our time today, we'll have a bit more of a sense of what we mean by that. So here's just a quick summary of what we'll go through today, in addition to the information that you've already been given. So we'll really be looking to answer the following 3 questions, starting with why zero waste? So essentially, why are we all here? What is zero waste, and what is zero waste more specifically asking of us? And then lastly, how can we get more involved? And that's where we'll talk more about what Zero Waste Canada is currently working on and how you can be part of that. So I'll be here for the full hour, and in the end, we'll have a chance for any questions or clarifications that you may have as well, just so you know. However, before we start answering those big overarching questions there, the first question Zero Waste Canada likes to start off with is this one right here. So answering the question of who. So who is Zero Waste Canada? Really for your benefit, since we live in this age of information, it's just good to know where that information is coming from and who it represents. So for those who are not familiar, Zero Waste Canada is an independent nonprofit organization and the Canadian national affiliate of the Zero Waste International Alliance. And among its core roles and responsibilities is that of developing programs and policies for zero waste that really extend at the community level into government and also at the organizational level, really all with the aim of furthering zero waste across Canada. As for myself, once again, my name is Paolo, and I'm really just providing this session here today on Zero Waste Canada's behalf. I mentioned Zero Waste Canada is the national affiliate of the Zero Waste International Alliance. So here as well, for those who are not familiar, the Alliance is a global community, a global network of individuals, of groups, of organizations that come together based on a common understanding of zero waste. And what this, among the core roles and responsibilities of this network is that of developing programs and policies that help further zero waste in different parts of the world. What is sort of considered to be among the most valuable aspects of this particular network is, first of all, its international nature, which you can get a little bit of a sense of here. Secondly, what this network ultimately produces in terms of programs and policies is considered to be quite valuable, also due to the diversity of areas and levels of expertise that it brings to the table. So there'll be groups here that will specialize specifically in zero waste. Others are coming at zero waste from more of a social justice perspective, others from more of a health-oriented perspective. Some are more advocacy-oriented, some are more research-based. So there's really quite a wealth and diversity of information that coming from different areas and levels of experience. And lastly, what's worth noting is that this network really operates from the bottom up. So when we talk about programs and policies, for example, those aren't just theoretical or aspirational. They're very much based on the concrete experiences of communities from all over the world. Ultimately, however, it really is very much a global community, the Zero Waste International Alliance. That's really the best way to refer to it. A global community really representing local communities who are impacted in a very real way by decisions that get made or that don't get made when it comes to waste specifically. And lastly, just to wrap up our little introduction here on who, this here is the vision and mission of the Zero Waste International Alliance. So just for reference, when you see words here, such as, for example, zero waste communities, just world, resilience, systemic change, environmental and social justice principles, these may not be the very first terms that come to mind when we say zero waste. However, this is the understanding of zero waste, at least on behalf of this global community. So essentially, it's more than just what bin does this go in, or how do we phase out, for example, plastic straws. That's all part of it for sure, but at the end of the day, it goes far, far deeper than just that. Okay. So that was just our little introduction. What we'll go into next is that first overarching question that I mentioned we'll be looking at today, which is why. So why zero waste? Why are we all taking time out of our days to be here? And really, why is zero waste being talked about more and more in the media and social media? Why are we seeing it talked about more even at a government and business level? And the reason why, very simply, as I'm sure you're all aware, is very simply that we have a waste problem. Which has really gotten to a point where it can no longer not be prioritized, along with other relevant issues, such as, for example, climate change. As I mentioned, the fact that we have a waste issue is probably not a surprise to any of you joining here today. By now, we've probably all seen the articles, we've probably all seen the images, seen the footage. And at this point as well, there's been plenty of decades of research, of information, of campaigns that have been run on these issues, of initiatives, strategies, even regulations that have been started to be put in place. However, despite all this effort over these many years, if we had to sum up where we stand today on the waste front, unfortunately, these images here would still be an accurate representation of where we currently are. These images here were taken from within the Metro Vancouver region, but they could just as easily be anywhere else in Canada or anywhere else around the world for that matter, unfortunately. And they really summarize on a small scale, of course, but really where we stand on the waste front. Highlighting, first of all, how much waste we actually generate on a daily basis, so much that we actually really struggle just to capture that material back, let alone how we deal with it afterwards. Secondly, what we can see even just on a small scale here is how still poor we have been at actually managing to separate that waste to at least give it a second life via recycling and composting, for example. And lastly, and arguably most importantly, when we look closely at these types of items here that are typical of our waste streams, our garbage, especially in North America, we can see how a lot of these items really are avoidable at the end of the day. So we've become accustomed to them, but if we really had to look at how much of this is actually necessary, we could probably all agree that we could be doing things quite a bit differently. And so this is one real basic reason why waste and why zero waste specifically have become much more of a topical issue, just out of the basic realization that we could be doing a whole lot more on the waste front, no matter which angle you look at it. Another major reason why is that we're learning more and more through research about what the actual impacts of these are further down the line. So if we continue to use these images here just as a reference point and follow the trail, so to speak, of where these are likely to end up, we'll find that there are really three primary outcomes for where all these materials here are likely to go. So if we start with what's on the ground there, so what doesn't actually get collected by our formal waste management systems, the likely outcome or form of away, so to speak, for these materials will be via water. So this is one where by now, again, we've probably all seen the images and seen and heard and understood what the condition of our oceans are in particular when it comes to waste. We say our oceans are ultimately downhill from everything. So aside from that being a problem, obviously for wildlife and for ecosystems, we're learning more through research about how that actually impacts even human health further down the line. And what we're learning is that essentially anything that we as humans consume out of our oceans today is a potential source, whether that's fish all the way down to sea salt. It's a potential source of plastic and other contaminants that we're essentially ingesting into our bodies. So you could really argue nowadays that we're eating our own waste in one form or another. So go back to our images here that are our reference point. If we focus on what actually does get collected and what's actually in those bins, and that we classify as garbage in this case, and where those are likely to go, there's really two primary outcomes. One is that it goes away once again, so to speak, via land, so via landfilling, which is a concept we're probably familiar with. However, landfills are of concern due to their accumulated impact over time, both due to what is released out of the top of landfill sites in terms of emissions, as well as in terms of what's left over or what leaches through the bottom of landfills. So eventually over time, all landfills will leach substances into, for example, our soils, potentially affecting things like our groundwater. So that's one whole area of concern with landfills. The other, as I mentioned, are the emissions that are coming out of the top of landfill sites, which can be of various kinds depending on what happens to be in them, which, as you can imagine, is anything and everything. But of particular concern has become the release of methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas believed to be at least 25 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, which is the one that gets a lot more attention when it comes to climate change. And the reason for the release of that gas is due to the presence of organics in our landfill sites, which of course do not belong there. So here as well, we can see how all these impacts really come back to us at the end of the day in more ways than we typically tend to realize. The alternative to landfilling, again, for all those materials that are actually collected by our waste management systems, is that instead of them being buried into the ground, they would be burned instead in what's known as a waste incinerator. So of the three here, this is the one that's probably less known or less, people are less aware of. Waste incinerators are really just a very large facility that burn waste at very high temperatures. The basic logic being, once again, just to keep materials out of landfills. So if we don't bury it into the ground, then how about we just burn it instead? That's the core logic of incineration. But just like with landfills, here as well, the concern is the accumulated impact of this process over time. Here as well, both because of what's being released out of the top of these facilities, as well as what's left over at the end of the burning process. When it comes to the emissions, what's of particular concern are the release of various forms of particulate matter, such as, for example, heavy metals, all the way to dioxins and furans, which are essentially known carcinogens. So yes, these facilities do have filters. However, we're talking very, very fine particulate matter. So realistically, they won't be able to capture 100% of those substances. And so even in very small amounts, because of the nature of those substances, they become a significant concern over time when they accumulate in our environment for both human health and just for environmental health more generally. So that's one area of concern. The other is is the ash residue that remains from the burning process. So just like if you think of a fireplace, you burn wood, most of that goes up into smoke, but what's left over will be an ash residue. So incinerators are very much the same in that sense, except in this case, instead of that ash being just from burning wood, in this case, that ash is coming from having burned waste. And so obviously that becomes of concern. Essentially what you're then dealing with there is really a hazardous material or a toxic ash that you then still need to dispose of, and which is typically done via a form of landfilling. So that's really the main logic for incineration that has come up in the last several decades in particular, that has been proposed as a solution. Basically, if you think about a truckload of waste showing up to an incinerator, that incinerator will burn most of that down and it'll condense it down to just the ash portion, the ash portion. So in terms of volumes, that will definitely reduce the volumes of waste you're then needing to deal with. However, the question then becomes, well, okay, we may have less waste to deal with now. However, now we have more hazardous waste or waste that is of greater concern due to the toxicity. So is that, at the end of the day, is that actually a worthwhile trade-off? So long story short, no matter where our waste goes, whether it's going away via water, via land, or via air, we're realizing how this is all coming back to us in many more ways that we often can see. So when we see phrases such as "there's no such thing as a way," that's not just an environmental slogan that looks nice on a campaign. It's very much a growing reality that we're learning more and more about over time. Another major reason why zero waste has become such a topical issue are these types of images here, which once again, we've probably by now all seen. These types of images of wildlife have really shocked many people around the world and have really been a significant catalyst for calls for action for zero waste specifically. Going into the those are more specific examples. If we take a step back to the bigger picture, this is the more so-called environmental argument for zero waste. So today we're currently in what some call ecological overshoot, which is really just really a fancy term to just say that we overconsume. So what these types of footprint analyses are suggesting is that the amount of resources that we consume in 1 year alone, it takes our Earth about 1 year and 7 months, according to calculations, to actually regenerate that material. So aside from the specific number, the point being here that we're taking from our Earth at a rate which is very simply unsustainable. And I know the word sustainability gets used a lot nowadays and in very many different ways. So it's sometimes we almost lose sight of what exactly it means because it's used in so many different ways. But when we look at things from this perspective here, it's very simply unsustainable in the most literal sense of the term. And here's where we see all that urgency coming from the climate movement as well as the waste movement, as this trend is only worsening over time. According to these same calculations here, if we look at it a little bit more specifically, so that one really was looking at a global perspective, we're really all in the same boat. Here's a map of per capita consumption. So essentially per person on average, how much we're consuming all over the world. And as you can see, North America in this case is awfully red in this map. And what that's suggesting is that if everybody in the world consumed on average the way we do here in North America, then we would need somewhere between 2 to 4 or possibly more Earths just to sustain that lifestyle, our lifestyle here in North America. So you could really argue that if anywhere we need to be asking ourselves, well, why zero waste? Here in North America is probably one of the areas in the world where we need to ask that question really before anybody else. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier social justice. So this is just one more reason why that we'll close on for this why section here. Why zero waste and why does zero waste merit really our attention. So you may have seen some of these headlines in the past few years here in Canada. Specifically, there was an incident between Canada and the Philippines a few years back, which again, you may have heard of. Essentially, Canada had shipped several containers worth of waste to the Philippines that had been labeled as recyclables. However, when they were received over in the Philippines, unfortunately, they opened those up and realized that it was really just mixed waste. So there were lots of materials in there that couldn't actually be recycled. And so the Philippines, understandably, and you could say agreeably, we're saying we don't want this material. So Canada, you're gonna have to take that back. These are actually not recyclables. And so after many years of discussions, eventually Canada did take those containers back, and they were burned in a local facility here in Metro Vancouver. However, that particular incident wasn't isolated. So since then, there have been a lot of other reports, Malaysia and other countries in Southeast Asia, especially, and not just concerning Canada either. This is becoming, unfortunately, a growing trend among high income nations or high consumption nations around the world who have gotten into the habit of shipping off those low value materials that really we can't do much with over here to other parts of the world for them to deal with. So these types of practices have been really labeled as environmental racism or environmental injustice. So these are all yet more reasons why, especially here in North America, we ought to be asking the question of why zero waste? Which brings us into our next section here of what. So what can we do about the waste issue? I realize the picture that we've just painted has not exactly been the most positive. However, what positives we can take out of it is that there's actually a whole lot that we can do about the waste issue. And that's really what we want to focus on here today. And that's what Zero Waste is wanting us to focus on. More specifically, we'll be looking to answer the question of what Zero Waste is asking of us. And in order to do that, there's two main resources that we want to share with you today, which are these right here. The first being the International Zero Waste Definition, and the second being the International Zero Waste Hierarchy. So these here are the two core foundational policies for zero waste on the international scene, peer reviewed. So meaning that this definition, for example, wasn't just put up on a blog somewhere online, but people from all over the world came together to work on it, to develop it. And they're both really crucial to answer that question of what is zero waste asking us. When it comes to the definition is really crucial. First of all, just to define what do we actually mean by zero waste. So similar to what we were saying earlier about sustainability, zero waste is another one of those terms that has been used in very many different ways, often conflicting with one another. So this definition really helps us clarify what we actually mean by zero waste, what would be considered zero waste and what not. The hierarchy then really complements the definition as it allows us to see how we can actually actualize that definition or achieve that definition. And when it comes to the hierarchy, it also outlines, first of all, our key do's and don'ts when it comes to zero waste, as well as the level of priority that we can give to the many actions that we can take in working towards zero waste. So in terms of takeaways from the hierarchy here today, the main takeaway would be that, first of all, zero waste happens in the top tier of the hierarchy that you see there. You can see it's divided into 3 sections. So if you're asking yourself, what can I do or what can we do to contribute to zero waste? There's ultimately many answers to that question, but as long as that action falls within rethink, redesign, reduce, and reuse in that top tier there, then that represents a zero waste action. The second takeaway from the hierarchy, if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll see the word unacceptable there, and in parentheses, incineration and waste to energy. So we've already introduced what incineration is as a process. Waste to energy is really just another term for the process of burning waste. What that's alluding to is the fact that modern incinerators can also generate some energy from the burning process. And so you could say really incinerators have rebranded, so to speak, calling themselves waste to energy facilities. It also just sounds a lot better than waste incinerator. However, at the end of the day, it's still a facility that's there to burn waste. That's its core function. So no matter how we refer to it, what we call it, or how it's done, because there's different ways in which you can do that, all forms of thermal treatment or of burning waste are considered unacceptable when it comes to zero waste. And there's many reasons why that is. We could have a whole session just on this one topic. However, just for the purposes of today, the main reason to understand as to why incineration is considered unacceptable is that it really very simply doesn't help us achieve that definition that you see there, zero waste, or achieve those actions that we see at the top of the hierarchy here, which once again are our focus when it comes to zero waste. And it's not just that incineration does not help us achieve those things, is that it actually works in the complete opposite direction. So when we introduce an incinerator into a community, what we're doing is basically introducing a 20, 30-year demand for more waste, because all that facility can really do is take waste and burn it. And so already there, we don't need to really be an expert to see how to solve this issue that we've just kind of explained about overconsumption, how burning our resources could really be a solution to our waste problem. So that's one of many reasons why, but point being, again, in terms of a takeaway here, that all forms of incineration are considered unacceptable under a zero waste strategy. The third and final takeaway from the hierarchy is that middle portion of the hierarchy that we haven't talked about yet. And as you can see, that begins with recycling and composting. So immediately here, many people will ask, well, why is recycling and composting only halfway up the hierarchy or halfway down, depending on how you want to look at it? And the answer very simply being that that's the value of recycling and composting, at least within a zero waste strategy. It's definitely part of the zero waste strategy. It's in the hierarchy. It's far from the unacceptable section. It's just not our core area of focus when it comes to zero waste. Zero waste is all about shifting our focus as much as we can towards the top tier of the hierarchy that you see there. Those are the actions that actually avoid waste, or at the very least, minimize waste, which again is the core objective of zero waste. Once we then have waste, we've exhausted all our opportunities to avoid waste at the top, that we now have waste that we then need to deal with, then the first question becomes, what can we do with that? And at which stage recycling and composting would be the most valuable thing that we could do. However, that's already at the waste stage. So zero waste is all about trying to emphasize preemptively how can we act to minimize or avoid waste entirely. So to understand the role of recycling more specifically within a zero waste strategy, Zero Waste Canada likes to reference this resource here, which is known as the WASTEBERG. So what the WASTEBERG teaches us is that for every ton of waste that you and I generate, on average, an average of 71 tons are generated in the production processes. So before we even have that item in our hand, the vast majority of our impact in terms of waste has actually already happened at prior stages. Once again, due to all the waste that is inherent in the manufacturing and production processes. So virtually anything that we're buying new will go through a process that will look something like this, depending on the material. There may be some differences, but essentially we'll start with extracting resources from our earth, transporting those resources, refining them, processing them, packaging them, shipping them off to a location where then we will come in, purchase those items, and then we may or may not recycle them at the waste management stage. But as we can see from the WASTEBERG here, the vast majority of the lion's share really of our impact in terms of waste is happening in that production and manufacturing stage. So what the WASTEBERG is really teaching us, and what zero waste is ultimately asking us in terms of the WASTEBERG, is to really think of the full WASTEBERG. Yes, let's focus on that 1 ton that we all visibly see at the end of the line, and how are we managing that waste? But just as much to think and look at those 71 tons that we don't typically see to the same degree that are beneath the surface. So when it comes to the role of recycling, even if we recycled 100% of our waste, that would really primarily be focusing on that 1 ton. It wouldn't necessarily be saying all that much about those 71 tons. So that's why, unfortunately, recycling doesn't quite address the full WASTEBERG the way zero waste is asking. So in terms of understanding what zero waste, so how do we actually address the full WASTEBERG and what zero waste is asking of us, the key word becomes reuse, much more so than recycling. So just to keep it nice and simple, to use a very, very basic example, if we walk into a coffee shop, for example, and we engage in a single-use practice, so we consume something in a single-use beverage, for example, what we'll be doing, so even if we recycle that item, that would be great, and that would definitely be more valuable than, for example, placing it into our garbage. However, the next day or the week after, or whenever we go by next, we'll be demanding that single-use item yet again and yet again and yet again. And so it'll still be demanding that those 71 tons, that entire process, start up all over again. Whereas when we engage in practices of reuse, first of all, we're no longer generating that 1 ton at the end of the line. So very simply because we're using a reusable item, so we're not generating waste ourselves. At the same time, because it's a reusable item, we're no longer also demanding that that manufacturing and production process start up all over again. So we're also addressing those 71 tons beneath the surface that we don't usually see to the same degree. So that's really why reuse is the core focus when it comes to zero waste. So I know we spend a lot of time and headspace in what we see on the left-hand side of the screen here. So there's a lot of single-use items out there, and we spend much of our time trying to understand, what's plastic, what's a bioplastic, what's a compostable plastic or a compostable item, what's biodegradable, is it paper-based, is it wax paper, if we rip it, could we maybe compost it? All these kinds of questions that we have on the recycling side, which is not wrong. It's good to inform ourselves about how those processes work. However, zero waste ultimately, once again, is asking us, and we can't overstate this enough, to really shift a lot of that time, a lot of those resources, a lot of that effort more towards reuse and the top end of the hierarchy, which I would also add often eliminates a lot of those questions as well. With reuse, it's often more straightforward. Is it reusable, yes or no? And there's usually less confusion in that area. So just to close off our section here on what Zero Waste Canada, or what Zero Waste is asking of us. Zero Waste Canada does like to end with this little scenario that it asks everybody to situate themselves in. So say you're, for example, in your kitchen, you're washing your dishes and your phone rings in the next room. So you step outside to grab it, you come back and you find your kitchen is completely flooded. What would you do first? Would you spring for a mop and start mopping up the floor? Or would you first go and turn off the tap? And so obviously it's a rhetorical question. The logical first step there would be to go turn off the tap. And as logical as it may seem in this scenario, if we translate the same logic over to the waste issue today, you could argue that we're doing as best we can to try and mop up the floor in the face of the challenge without really doing enough to turn off that tap. And so that's, again, what the real ask is when it comes to zero waste, is to channel our efforts towards turning off the tap first and foremost. Which leads us to our last section here on how. So how do we actually participate in zero waste, or how can we participate in zero waste? How do we achieve zero waste? Ultimately, again, there's many answers to that question, but what we'll focus on here today is how Zero Waste Canada is currently approaching it, and that will lead into opportunities for you all to participate in those initiatives where of interest. So first of all, just a couple of notes on Zero Waste Canada. Zero Waste Canada does operate, as I mentioned earlier, at various different levels, one being community. So there are various, for example, volunteering and educational efforts happening at that level in Zero Waste Canada, which are opportunities to get involved. However, these are also obviously available, beyond just Zero Waste Canada. Wherever you are, wherever you happen to be, there are often local groups that you can participate in, and often that's really where the most valuable actions take place, is at that community level locally and getting involved in whatever is happening where you happen to be. Other levels that Zero Waste Canada is operating at are at government, as well as at the organizational level. When it comes to government, it's really being in the room and making sure that conversations and policies are moving further and further, at least in the direction of zero waste, and further away from concepts and practices that we know are obstacles to zero waste. So for example, incineration is a good example of that. At the business level, on the other hand, or at the organizational level, it's really providing guidance and support to those businesses or organizations who are wanting to move in the direction of zero waste, who may not necessarily know quite how to go about that. And an example of how to do that at an organizational or facility level is, for example, offered by this particular program here that Zero Waste Canada has developed, which is designed for facilities wanting to work towards zero waste. So this is something that is applicable to any type of facility. It doesn't have to be a business. It could be a nonprofit. It could be a school, a community center, any type of facility. There's criteria at each and every one of these levels. And as long as that facility demonstrates having met those criteria, They can first of all receive recognition at any one of these levels for having done so, but more importantly, it really offers that facility a guide, a roadmap in terms of working in the direction of zero waste. And the reason for the various levels is exactly for that, to acknowledge that zero waste is a mentality shift. It does often take some time to implement that shift. And these levels are really there to reflect that. It's a work in progress further and further in the direction of zero waste. But what we really want to focus on here today are the educational programs that Zero Waste Canada has developed and that you've already received some information about, starting with the Zero Waste Fundamentals program. So here as well, along the same logic of the facility certification program we've just seen, here as well, Zero Waste Canada has worked towards a ladder of programs at various levels, in this case to help individuals move along further in their personal zero waste journey. So that once again starts with the Zero Waste Fundamentals program, which, as the name suggests, offers a strong foundation in zero waste practices, zero waste policies, and in that zero waste mentality, as I mentioned, that often takes some time to develop. And that program really covers a lot of the concepts that we've just introduced here today. So it goes into a good amount of detail into the zero waste definition, the hierarchy, recycling and composting, incineration, the WASTEBERG concept, all these concepts that we've just introduced here today, and not just on the environmental front, on the social justice front as well, are all covered in that fundamentals program. And the objective really being to provide individuals, once again, a strong understanding of zero waste that Zero Waste Canada would believe to be above average in most cases, really going into those policies and practices, how are they developed and what do they mean? So that's really the core sort of function of that program. And the reason why people ultimately may want to sign up for that program really varies. So some people are really just interested in zero waste and just want to go through the course to learn more about it. Some are just hearing a lot about zero waste and want to make sense of everything that they're hearing, and that program may reinforce that desire on their end. Some look at that program more from a professional or career perspective, wanting to maybe work in that particular area in the future. So they may see that as a first step to move in that direction. Or much more simply, just it often is the case that it's just, I work in a particular facility, wherever that may be, and I'm not maybe quite happy where we are on the waste front. I want to help us improve. And they may want to take that program just to see, okay, what tools or resources can Zero Waste Canada maybe provide that will allow me to improve our performance in our work, in our home, in our community, wherever that may be. So those are some reasons why people may want to join or sign up for the program. Again, there's ultimately many that we could speak of, and there's usually a range. It really goes from students all the way to people who are already professionals in waste or in zero waste signing up for the program. All really meant to give those individuals, to empower them to then proceed on their zero waste journey, however they see best fit. You'll notice here as well, there is a second program that's mentioned there, a Zero Waste Associate Program. So just for reference, that program is really meant or designed to take the fundamentals knowledge that you've acquired to the next level. So it goes into more detail into, for example, policies for zero waste, very much into detail, having a really strong grasp of what those are, what they mean, starting with the zero waste hierarchy, but also giving more practical steps on how you could actually implement zero waste specifically at the facility level. So it covers, for example, how to perform a waste audit at a professional level, how to conduct a zero waste facility assessment, how to track a facility's performance towards zero waste over time, how to develop a zero waste plan. So it's a little bit more, it's more into detail into those particular practical steps and really just taking that knowledge and the fundamentals a step further. So ultimately, Zero Waste Canada is continuously working on more programs, so there'll be more further down the line. There's more that are being developed as we speak, but really the starting point is that fundamentals program that you see there, as that's really making sure we're all on the same page as what do we mean by zero waste? How do we understand, how do we interpret that particular term? So that's really where we wanted to end off today in our session, is giving a bit more information on that fundamentals program. So just for reference, the fundamentals program is first of all divided up into five sessions. They are all online sessions and they're all pre-recorded. So you can really go about them on your own time, based on your own schedule, based on your own learning pace. Some people will go through it in 2 or 3 days. Some people will go through it over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. It's really completely up to you. It's very flexible in that sense. They're all online sessions. They're open to anybody. There's no prerequisites. So you don't need any kind of background in sustainability or anything like that to sign up for the program. It's really designed for anybody to be able to sign up for it. Those who do successfully complete the program will receive a Zero Waste Canada Zero Waste Fundamentals Program Certificate of Completion. So that's something that you can just show for having completed that program and acquired that level of knowledge of zero waste. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier the additional program, the Zero Waste Associate Program. Completing the fundamentals is a prerequisite for that program. So once you've completed the fundamentals, you'll also be eligible for that Zero Waste Associate Program and the designation that comes with it. The designation is essentially that you'll be recognized as a Zero Waste Associate by Zero Waste Canada. So that's just another benefit further down the line of signing up for the fundamentals program. And the knowledge in the fundamentals really is the foundation for those subsequent programs, as we mentioned earlier. So that's really what we wanted to cover for the specifics of the program. What I'll just mention with you now is, first of all, sharing that promo code that you see there. So that's open for everybody who's on the call here today. There is a link at the bottom, but we'll also share the link in the chat and also via email after today for you to actually use that code. But that code is, again, for everybody here to utilize to access the fundamentals program. Yeah, we're of interest. So that's really it for, I'll keep this up maybe for anybody who wants to take a quick screenshot or a note of that. But that's what we wanted to cover for our session here today. So I'll pass it back to Caitlin.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I'll just also say, well, I love that you get a certificate with it too, because often we do a lot of online training, but there's no way to kind of show that you've done this training. So I always love to see that. And then also just a note to say that First Credit Union will be sponsoring people who finish the fundamentals course and want to go on to do the Zero Waste Associate Program. We will be sponsoring folks to do that. So that's really exciting. And that's like a $300 value per, for the associate program. So that's really neat. And I just open it up to the floor for questions. If anyone has a question or a comment or wants to share with us, what brought you here today, please feel free.
Quick question on the course. So it is self-guided. Is there a certain amount of time that you need to complete it, like within parameters that way?
There's no limit. I don't know if Caitlin, you had an objective on your end, but no, there is no sort of limit in terms of time at the moment.
Awesome. Very good.
Hello, I have a couple of questions just in regards to the presentation. I know this is sort of a really general one and we'll move on later, but I noticed that you guys lumped recycle and compost together on your hierarchy. And I'm wondering, like for somebody, I guess I can kind of see if what you're composting has gone through a whole production and transportation and into the grocery store. But for me, like I grow my own garden and then compost my waste from that. So I don't view those in the same bucket the way that they were on the hierarchy. And I was wondering just what your thoughts on that were.
For sure, yeah. And there's definitely a distinction, first of all, between what we would call industrial composting, so at a much larger scale versus, for example, backyard composting.
Yeah.
Definitely with the backyard composting being, we would say, a lot more valuable. You have a lot more control over that, and it's just a very different scale, obviously. But for recycling and composting, it's really just still all seen as waste from a zero waste perspective. So especially nowadays, you see a lot of these compostable products out there, and it's also addressing that there is often the assumption that, oh, it's compostable, so that means that it's a zero waste initiative. And for sure, if it's replacing something that's going to end up in the garbage or being sent for disposal or burned or landfilled, that would be, you could say, preferable. However, it would still be waste. We often see events that are, for example, labeled as zero waste. Everything's compostable. And at the end of the event, there's a very large bin full of cups and containers and all sorts of items. So that's not quite what we would consider to be zero waste. It is still waste at the end of the day. So the objective would be to minimize that first and foremost. But in your case, in terms of gardening, that's
the differentiator.
That's a great zero waste practice. So that's that's at a higher level for sure.
It's a good
And
question.
then I have two more questions actually.
Sure.
When you say the reuse, is there a hierarchy within the reuse? Like, is it, because I know reusable can be plastic, it can be metal, like, is there a better and worse or a good, better, best when it comes to reusable products?
Yeah, it's a great question. So with reuse, there's definitely various ways to look at it. So the material does matter when it comes to reuse. So first of all, just always thinking the end of life, eventually something will reach an end of life. So what would that end of life look like? And the material will be something to keep in mind there. But also just in terms of durability. So you could reuse something, 5 to 10 times, or you could reuse it depending on the material 100+ times, right? So that is definitely something to consider. The type of material is also whether you're reusing it yourself or it's being donated. So often donation gets sort of passed as reuse, but often that's just wasteful practices that are just being kind of, labeled as donation and sort of passed on to somebody else. So that's also not always ideal. What I would say for in terms of rating them, so that hierarchy that we've mentioned here today, that's just a visual of the hierarchy. There's actually a whole policy document that comes along with it. So we could actually share that after today if of interest. But that actually goes specifically into each level of the hierarchy and what do all those levels mean. So with reuse, there isn't necessarily a categorization by material. It will depend, but that will give a lot more information as to the various levels and what they mean and what qualifies as what. Even in terms of composting, there is a specification there, for example, about industrial versus backyard composting. So if of interest, we can definitely share that. And that's one of those areas that the associate program goes into more detail.
Well, my last question, and one last question, I promise, is it drives me crazy. Or when it comes to produce, organic versus zero waste. You go to the grocery store and everything organic is wrapped in single-use plastic, and everything non-organic you could buy with no plastic waste. Thoughts on that?
I'm familiar with the struggle.
Yeah.
It's complicated. It's often things aren't always in alignment, right? So it's really about choosing of the various values that you're wanting to keep in mind. There's waste, there's how far is it coming from? It could be a zero waste item, but it's coming from halfway around the world, right? If it's more locally sourced, that would be better from, for example, a climate perspective. There's often many values that we're trying to grapple with, and it's not always easy for one item to check all the boxes. And unfortunately, it's not ideal, but that's how it unfortunately seems to be. So I'm very familiar with that particular issue. Really, when it comes to organic, it's more looking at so that you'll see a lot of that in like supermarkets, for example. Whereas if you try and purchase from perhaps your local store or your local zero waste store, if you have one in your area, from a market, you'll tend to see that typically less. But it's a tough one. Not everybody has the chance to do that. First of all, it's not always as accessible. Not everybody has a zero waste store in their area. It's really about struggling, and there's never a clear answer, unfortunately, with which value to you is more important. And what I would just say on that is zero waste isn't asking for perfection. Obviously, not all of this should be on the consumer or on on us as individuals. A lot of zero waste is really advocating for systemic change, so going back to the source, pushing back on certain business models, certain practices that are unnecessarily wasteful. So at an individual level, it's is trying to pick your battles, I would say, because unfortunately, it'd be very difficult to check all the boxes in every circumstance. But it's I can relate to it. It's a struggle. Yeah.
The struggle is real.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. It was a great presentation.
No worries. Thank you.
Any other questions?
It's been great questions so far.
Yeah. I was gonna say, Tanya, I bought a new pillow the other day, and it came in this plastic bag, and I actually have it sitting by my back door because I think I'm gonna mail it back to them, and it's gonna cost me $15, but just to say, like, really, here, you deal with this. I don't want to have to deal with this. So I think consumer, we have a lot of power as well, but it takes a lot of complaining, which can grate on the soul.
That's a great example though of just challenging certain practices. There's a lot of local zero waste stores that I've spoken with who are just like, we just asked our supplier, could you just send it to us in a reusable container and then we give it back to you? And just the question had just never been asked, and they're like, oh, okay, we could try and do that. And it's actually a lot less complicated than people may think. So sometimes it's just no one's bothered to make that point or to ask that question or to bring it up. So that's a great example there of what you just mentioned of starting to try and do that. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, I used to work at a zero waste grocery store as well, but I find even just as a consumer, if you ask your local deli if they'll put your olives or your deli meat in your own container, they're often happy to do that, but they're not going to offer it as an option if you don't ask.
Yeah, that's another one that's very true. And that facility certification program that I mentioned earlier, that's one of the criteria in there actually is shouldn't be up to the individual to have to go out of their way to ask, or sometimes uncomfortable conversation. You don't know if you're allowed or not. It should be up to that facility, that establishment, really encouraging it, right? Wanting to see people participating in those types of practices and making it easier for people, making it, an environment where they're welcome and open to doing that. That's one of those criteria. So that's definitely one, again, I can relate to in that sense.
Great. Well, if that's everything, thank you so much. Thank you, Zero Waste Canada. Thank you, Paolo.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time.
Have a great night, everyone. Bye.